Hello, I'm Dr. David Adams. The parables of Jesus are popular with both readers and preachers of the Bible, but they present the interpreter, and thus the preacher, with some distinctive challenges. In this session, we're going to look at the challenges and the opportunities that come with reading and preaching from parables. There are really two related issues here, and we'll treat them separately. First, there's the question, what is a parable? That is, what does a parable try to do, and how does it try to do it? This will lead us to the second, related issue that we'll consider. How should we go about the task of interpreting parables? That is, what kinds of questions should we ask? And how do we go about finding the answers to those questions? Well, let's begin by turning to the first question. What is a parable? If we think back to the ministry of Jesus and the way he taught his disciples, the parables stand out as a very distinctive feature of Jesus' ministry. Because they are so distinctive, and because they're different from all the other speeches and actions of Jesus, interpreters have debated the nature of parables and their role in the teaching of Jesus for a long time now. Part of the difficulty lies in understanding the term parable itself. The Greek word used in the New Testament is parabole. There's been a lot of discussion over the centuries about the exact nature of the type of literature that this word refers to. Much of this discussion has been rooted in the Greek rhetorical tradition. But one of the things that probably hasn't received enough attention is the fact that this Greek word, parabole, used by the translators of the Septuagint, the early Greek translation of the Bible, this word was used as the translation for one particular Hebrew word, the word mashal. Now, this verb occurs both as a verb and as a noun. As a verb, it means to be like something. It's used to express a comparison. The noun mashal is usually translated with the English gloss proverb, although that's probably a little misleading for modern readers. The modern reader thinks of a proverb as a short, pithy little saying that's a clever way of expressing some truth, like a stitch in time saves nine. That's certainly appropriate for some proverbs, but it doesn't really help the modern reader to understand what a mashal really is. Maybe a better general translation for the Hebrew mashal might be something like a comparison. The point is that most mashalim express a truth based on the observation that involves some comparison with an aspect of the world around us. Personally, I tend to think of a mashal as a wisdom saying, since as a type of literature, wisdom sayings, or mashalim, represent insights that are drawn from observations about the world around us. Now, at this point, it might be helpful to review the nature of Old Testament wisdom literature and the wisdom theology that we find in the Tanakh. There are two basic approaches to theology in the Tanakh, two different perspectives on thinking about and talking about who God is and what he does. The approach that is familiar to most of us, because it's the majority approach in the Old Testament, is the perspective that we might call prophetic theology. Prophetic theology approaches the problem of how to understand and talk about the revelation of God and his work as it is seen in, with, and under the events of history. The basic idea behind prophetic theology is that God is revealed by what he does on the stage of history. And so, for example, one of the most important themes that runs through the plague narratives, the story of the 10 plagues that God brings upon Egypt in the book of Exodus. One of the most important themes that runs through that material is the theme that God is performing these mighty acts so that Egypt and Israel alike may know who Yahweh is. So the prophets are those who interpret and proclaim Yahweh on the basis of what God has done in the past, what he's doing in their own day, and what he will do in the future. When we think about prophets, we tend to focus on the predictive aspect of their preaching. But as a matter of fact, if you look at what the prophets are actually doing, most of their time is spent talking about what God has done in the past as a basis for understanding what he's doing in their own day. Predicting what God will do in the future is an important part of the work of the prophets, but the point of telling the future is not telling the future for its own sake. It's just one aspect of understanding who God is on the basis of how he reveals himself in, with, and under his actions in history. History past, history present, and history future. That's prophetic theology. The other approach, and it's the minority approach in the Tanakh, is what we would call wisdom theology. Wisdom theology is found in those books that we identify as wisdom literature, like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, the Song of Songs, and others. But it's also found as a theological motif in other books as well, where wisdom insights are mixed with insights from prophetic theology as well. And most importantly, with insights that God reveals directly through the Torah, the special revelation of God to his people. Wisdom theology also deals with understanding the revelation of God and his work. But instead of seeing the way that God reveals himself in, with, and under the events of history, wisdom theology focuses on understanding who God is and how he works as he has revealed himself in, with, and under the order that God has built into creation. Wisdom theology looks to the world that God has created and the order that God has built into his creation as an expression of what the British author Dorothy L. Sayers once described as the mind of the maker. Wisdom theology operates by observing what God has made in his creative work, and especially the order that God has built into the cosmos that he created, where we can see the mind of the maker revealed. We can see this approach expressed in the Tanakh in passages like Psalm 19, where we read, and starting with verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. The psalmist's point here is that all creation bears witness to the glory of God and proclaims his handiwork, not just among his people, but to the ends of the earth. This is just one example of a wisdom approach to understanding and expressing who God is and what he does. And while this wisdom approach to theology is a distinctive feature of the Tanakh, the idea that God has revealed himself through his creative work is not limited to the Old Testament. In the New Testament, in Romans chapter 1, for example, St. Paul reflects a similar approach when he writes, For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Here, St. Paul is reflecting the same basic idea that we have in the wisdom literature of the Tanakh, namely that God has revealed himself through his creative work. Now, that doesn't mean that we can learn everything about God from how he's revealed himself in creating the world. Wisdom literature also recognizes the Torah, the special revelation of God and his ways found in the written word. But as it affirms, there are some things that we can learn about God by observing how he has created the world. And that remains true even in a fallen world, because while the order that God built into creation has been corrupted by sin and by the disorder that sin introduced into the world, it has not been entirely eliminated by them. So wisdom theology takes as its starting point the way that God is revealed in, with, and under the order that God built into creation. But there are other aspects of wisdom theology as well. Another important aspect of wisdom literature is the idea that wisdom is relational. The wise man is the one who understands his relationship to others and his place in the world, and most especially his relationship to God. That's why the chief principle of wisdom literature is expressed in the saying, "The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom." This concept of the fear of Yahweh is one of the ways that the Tanakh talks about one's relationship with God. To live in the fear of Yahweh is to live in a proper relationship with God. So the saying, "the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom," is really another way of saying that understanding your relationship with God and living in a proper relationship with God is the beginning of wisdom. Throughout the Tanakh, the wise man is the one who understands the order that God has built into the world and his place in it. Because he does understand his place in the world and in relation to God, the wise man can look at how the world works and understand how to live in relation to God and how to live in relation to others. So that's the essence of wisdom theology, and that's the way that it differs from prophetic theology in the Old Testament. Fine, you say, but what does all of this have to do with the parables of Jesus? Well, the answer is simple enough, really. Miracles are a reflection of the prophetic theology of the Tanakh. They are God at work on the stage of history to reveal himself and accomplish his will through actions performed in history. The parables of Jesus are an application of the wisdom approach to understanding God and his ways. They're rooted in the observation of the world and operate by drawing a comparison between some aspect of the world around us and the kingdom of God. That's why Jesus introduces so many of his parables with the phrase, "the kingdom of God," or "the kingdom of heaven," is like so and so. So to return to our question, what is a parable? I would answer that question by saying that a mashal, a parabole, a parable, captures some aspect of life in the world and uses it to teach a lesson about the kingdom of God. It can do that in a short, pithy saying, a proverb in the popular sense of that term, or it can do it by telling a story that depicts some aspect of the world and draw a lesson from that. In either case, it's the comparison that's the main thing. I'm Dr. David Adams. In our next session, we'll come back and take a look at the second question. How should we interpret parables? So I hope you'll join us for that as well.